Hi everyone, today I'm going to be covering topic 5.1, which is evidence for evolution from the IB Diploma Biology program. So I will be covering each topic one by one, and I will make sure to cover all of the learning objectives set by the IB. So the objectives will be written on the slide under the title, so that way you can cross-reference with other sources and make sure that you know everything which the IB wants you to know. So let's get started. So the very first objective, what is evolution? So let's find out. So evolution, the official definition which you need to know, is the cumulative change in the heritable characteristics of a population over time. So let's break this down. Cumulative change means a series of small changes over many generations. So it's all of these changes together. And then heritable characteristics, as looked at in Unit 3 genetics, is just any trait which can be inherited from a parent by an offspring. And a population is just a group of organisms belonging to the same species. So that is what evolution is. Evolution might be small scale, which refers to changes in allele frequency between different generations. So because of natural selection, which we will cover later on, the frequency in alleles of certain traits will change from parent generation to their offspring to the next generation. And these are all small scale changes. Evolution can also be large scale, which is the descent of a different species from a common ancestor over many generations. So this is the evolution you may be more familiar with, which is when species evolve into other species over a longer period of time through all these frequent small-scale changes adding up. So now let's talk about the fossil record, which is very important in providing evidence for evolution. So what is a fossil? A fossil is a preserved remains of any organism. So there can be direct or indirect fossils. So a direct fossil is a body fossil. This includes bones, teeth, shells, leaves, etc. So these are actual physical fossils. And then indirect fossils are also called trace fossils. So these refer to footprints, teeth marks, etc. So they're not objects, but rather signs that an organism used to be present in that geographical location. So paleontology is the study of fossils, and it gives us a lot of evidence for evolution. So the way fossils are preserved is in strata. So strata are layers of sedimentary rock on the earth, which help to preserve fossils over time. Each strata has unique characteristics, and they each have different kinds of fossils within them. So strata are arranged in an order. The strata which are lower down in the Earth's surface are older, and then over time, layers of sedimentary rock developed on top of these, and then more and more. So the strata higher up are newer strata, and thus the fossils within these are newer fossils. And this is very important when we're trying to figure out the age of certain organisms and look at the progress of evolution over time. So the fossil record is the sum of all fossils and their placement within strata, within rock. So yeah, the fossil record shows evidence for evolution in many ways. So there are four primary evidence which the fossil record provides for evolution. The first is that the sequence in which fossils appear within the fossil record match that which they would be expected to evolve in. So let's make this a little bit clearer. So you would expect that simple organisms, according to evolution, would have been created first, and then over time they would develop and evolve into more complicated and complex organisms. This is actually what we see in the fossil record. So in lower down and older strata, we can see more simple organisms like bacteria and prokaryotic organisms. So we see their fossils. However, as you go to newer and higher strata, we begin to see fossils of more complicated creatures. This makes sense with evolution because it shows that the simpler organisms have developed over time to more complex creatures. The sequence of the fossil record also fits with the ecology of the Earth, as plant fossils appear lower down, i.e. in lower strata, than animal ones, which makes sense because if you look at the food chain, animals, the first primary consumers, ate producers or plants. So plants would need to come first so that herbivorous animals could eat the plants, and then carnivorous animals would eat the herbivorous animals, and so on. So plant organisms are lower down, so this makes sense as well. Many fossil sequences also help to link organisms with their likely ancestors. So we can see, for example, that in one strata, there's an ancient organism called Hyraxorium. So this is some creature which was similar to a rhinoceros, and this was an ancestral organism. And as we look up at the newer and higher strata, we see horses, zebras, rhinos, and other creatures that seem to have been evolved from this creature. So this shows an evolutionary link between these animals and the order in which they had evolved. Finally, and probably the most interesting or most powerful evidence given from the fossil record, is that little to no fossils of currently living organisms can be found within the fossil record. So what does that mean? We see fossils of several organisms within the fossil record, but almost none of organisms that we see currently in the present day. What this indicates to us is that all of the organisms living in our Earth at the moment have evolved from different ancestral species, and that's why we only find these ancestral species in the fossil record, not the currently living organisms. So selective breeding. So selective breeding is also known as artificial selection, and it is a process by which humans breed animals or plants for certain traits. There's two main ways that this is carried out. So selective breeding may be done in order to pick desirable traits. So what happens is humans pick traits which they think are favorable in certain species, and they breed plants with those traits in order to produce more offspring with those characteristics. So this is selecting for. Favorable traits are selected for. Alternatively, humans may also selectively breed animals or plants to select against negative traits. Let's say that a organism in a species has a significant genetic condition, or they have something which makes them less likely to survive and less well adapted to their environment or the function that humans use the species for. Humans, of course, want to eliminate this characteristic within the population, so they will not breed these animals and will breed the ones which do not possess this trait instead, to reduce the frequency of this negative trait in the future generations. Selective breeding thus leads to large and fast changes in a species over time, which is evolution. So there's a common example of selective breeding is dogs. So dogs have been domesticated by humans from wolf ancestral species, so gray wolves. So this is why there are several different breeds of dogs in the moment, because different wolves were all selectively bred for different characteristics, and this led to dogs which are more loyal to humans and can be domesticated. As a result, these domesticated breeds vary greatly from their ancestral species. Now let's look at homologous structures. So homologous structures are something which the IB really puts emphasis on and which you need to know about the pentadactyl limb that I will discuss in this slide. So what are homologous structures? Homologous structures are structures that are common between species which were derived from a common ancestor. However, they perform different functions in each of these species. So these structures develop through adaptive radiation. Adaptive radiation is a form of divergent evolution. And this basically means that although these species have evolved from a common ancestor, because they are placed in different environments which have different selective pressures, they will develop and evolve differently. They need to meet different environmental conditions, and thus these structures change to perform different functions in each of these species, despite initially having been the same in all the species. So this basically helps the organisms to fill ecological niches and meet environmental conditions. The example which you need to know specifically is that of the pentadactyl limb, which is a 5-digit limb that is homologous amongst all tetrapod creatures. So this, of course, includes reptiles, amphibians, mammals, etc. So what are the different bones in the pentadactyl limb that you need to know? You do not need to know it for every organism, but you should be able to label them on a diagram if presented. So let's have a look at this. Here you can see on the right side a picture of different organisms, and you can see the pentadactyl limb in each of them. So this is the human. This big purple bone right here, which some of you may be accustomed to, is the humerus. So this is our humerus. And you can see that's the same here. Here, basically the purple bones on each of these creatures are all the same bone, despite looking very different in each of them. And then we have this blue part here. This is the radius. And this is on the inside of the thumb, and the other one on the outside is the ulna. These you may be familiar with from middle school biology, but it's important that you can recognize that these do not look the same in every creature. So you can see that, for example, let's look at whales here. They're fused together because whales need to swim. They don't need these bones, rather they fuse them together to make a short and wider fin. And finally, of course, we also need to know that here is the carpals. This orange part is carpals on each of the creatures. This part here is the metacarpals. And this part here is our phalanges. So these you can see, like I said, are different in each creature. In birds, this is an interesting one. They are all fused together here, as you can see. So this is because birds need to fly. They don't need fingers, right? Like humans do. They don't grasp things. As a result, they have developed to their ecological conditions and their need to fly by fusing them together to make for a more effective wing that allows them to create momentum and fly more easily. Horses, you can see this is the leg rather than the forelimb, but you can see here that it is a single kind of like fused together, which helps them to walk and gallop. So those are homologous structures, but we also have something which is an opposite idea to that, that is analogous structures. So analogous structures are almost the exact opposite of homologous structures. So they are structures in different species which are very similar, which perform very similar or the same function. However, they did not derive from a common ancestor, so they evolved completely separately from one another. They just happen to be similar because of different or similar selective pressures. So these, as opposed to adaptive radiation, these develop through convergent evolution, which is when unrelated species develop similar traits because they grow up in similar environments. Thus, selective pressures are the same. An example of this is butterfly wings and bat wings. Since both butterflies and bats need to fly, both of their structures, like their wings, have developed in a way that is very similar to each other to perform the same function of flying. However, these wings did not develop from a common ancestor, as butterflies and bats are unrelated ancestrally. So this is something to consider, and that it gives biologists a lot of complications at times because it can make it difficult to classify whether species are actually related, which you will look at further in units 5.2 and 5.3. We also have something called vestigial structures, which are not analogous. This is a separate concept. So vestigial structures are homologous. They are structures that no longer serve a function in certain organisms because they are homologous to functional structures in other species. An example is human wisdom teeth. So we all get our wisdom teeth, which can be very annoying and painful for some people, but they actually don't have a function in humans at present. We have wisdom teeth because in other organisms which we evolved like from a common ancestor with, these teeth do serve a function and help them to digest the foods that are compose their diets. So these are homologous to functional structures in those species. Let's look at speciation. So this is kind of similar to the previous concepts that we looked at of homologous, analogous, and adaptive radiation or convergent evolution. So how exactly do species evolve into different species and produce new species? So this process is called speciation. When populations of a species are separated, whether geographically or through other forms, which you'll find out in the later units, they may evolve differently to adapt to their respective conditions and environmental needs. So because of different selective pressures in each of their unique environments, they will adapt, whether that's through the things that I mentioned before, like their structures, anatomy, but also their appearance, mating rituals, etc., will change and will diverge greatly over time or gradually. This term is important, that populations diverge gradually. So eventually, the populations become so different that they can no longer be considered the same species. And the main thing which scientists use to determine that they are now two different species are that they can no longer interbreed. If they can no longer breed to produce fertile offspring, they have speciated their different species. Because this process happens very gradually, they diverge gradually, various stages of divergence, i.e. continuous variation, can be observed across a geographical range at any moment. So you will see animals and organisms in all different phases of evolution and different levels of divergence as they are all gradually changing. This can sometimes cause complications because it's difficult for taxonomists to classify when exactly two species have become speciated, when a speciation event has occurred. It can cause a lot of vagueness, and an example of that is red grouse and willow ptarmigan. So these birds were once considered separate species with each of these respective names, but currently are considered one single species. So scientists may change their mind over time as they find that they can still interbreed or they are not different enough to be considered two species just yet. Finally, we have a case study, which you will need to know for your IB exams because the IB specifically wants you to know this example. So this is the case study of peppered moths. This is one that is been refuted online, and in recent times, people have started to question the validity of this example. But as far as the IB is concerned, you will need to know this, so don't let the internet confuse you. So dark varieties of light insects are referred to as melanistic, and the peppered moth is an example of an insect which comes in a melanistic form. So it comes in the melanistic dark form, which you can see on the left side of the image, on the right-hand side, as well as a white or light form. Previously, only or mostly the white form of the insect was found because trees were covered in pale lichen, and as a result, white moths were selected for because their light color helped them to camouflage on the trees. The selective pressure of being predated by predators in the area caused natural selection to select for the light-colored moths because they could hide from predators. Thus, the allele of the gene which gave them this light coloring was passed on more frequently to their offspring, and so in general, this was a much more common variety. However, after the Industrial Revolution and increased carbon emissions, etc., sulfur dioxide pollution ended up killing the lichens on most trees, and the soot from combustion of different fuels and products also blackened the trees further and sooting them. As a result, the white moths were now being killed more frequently than the black ones. So because they could no longer camouflage, and instead natural selection began to select for black moths because these black moths now survived more often, thus were more likely to survive until reproductive stage and pass these traits on to their offspring. Black moths survive to reproduce, allele frequency thus changed. So currently there are more black peppered moths present than other varieties. So I hope that this video was helpful in covering